Hi, everybody. I think we might look at getting started now. And welcome to Lawyers for Climate Action's webinar looking at key developments in climate change and international trade law. My name is Jessica, and I am Executive Director at Lawyers for Climate Action, and I'm really excited for the conversation that we're going to have today. We're going to be delving into what many call a revolution in international trade law, as we see increasing references and incorporation of climate change in international trade instruments. And the questions that we're looking at today is what are these developments? What do they mean for New Zealand at a government and business level? But also we're looking at this broader idea and conceptualization that we're seeing of climate change as a question of economic and finances important. And I'm joined today by Bjørn-Oliver Magsig. So he is on the Lawyers for Climate Action Board, Associate Dean International at Victoria University, Wellington, and Chair of our International Issues Subcommittee. And also by Hannah Bain, who is Special Counsel at Russell McVeagh, focused on climate change. Without further ado, I'll hand over to our panelists. Just to note that we're going to reserve question time at the end, so we'll reserve about 15 or 20 minutes of time for questions. Please ask questions throughout the session if you do have them, and if not, we'll get them at the very end. But thank you very much for joining us again. And if you're not a member yet of Lawyers for Climate Action, but you'd like to join our 370 strong membership of lawyers and people interested in how we can use the law to more effectively tackle the climate crisis, please do go on our website and sign up. You'll get much more of these webinars and a monthly update about what we're doing and key developments in this space as well. All right, I'll pass over to our panelists.
Kia ora, everyone. My name is Hannah Bain. I work at Russell McVeagh and really delighted to be here today. I'm just going to give me 1 second because I'm just going to share my screen. Not this one. All right, just make this larger. So thanks, Jess, for the introduction. As Jess covered, we are going to talk today a little bit about climate change in New Zealand's international trade agreements, and really wonderful to be here with someone as knowledgeable as Bjørn-Oliver as well to take us through some of the details of that topic. But really the reason that I'm here is to talk about this in the context of New Zealand organisations and what these international trade agreements and the climate-related obligations under them mean in terms of the way that we do business here in New Zealand. So just to quickly cover off what we are going to talk about. So I'll spend about 10 minutes just on an introduction to the impact of international developments on climate change in New Zealand. Then I will hand over to Bjørn-Oliver. He will go into a bit more detail about climate change in New Zealand's free trade agreements, in particular the recent ones with the EU, the UK, etc. And then I will give another 10 minutes around the implications of New Zealand's free trade agreements for New Zealand businesses, both in terms of the actual enforcement of those agreements, but the broader context as well around how this operates and why New Zealand businesses need to take these things seriously. And then we've left some time at the end for discussion and questions. So please do store up your questions to ask at the end of the session. So just to get started, anytime I'm ever talking about climate, I think it's helpful to bring us back to the international context. In my experience, it's quite tempting to adopt a bit of an inward-looking focus when we're talking about climate and how it relates to New Zealand. For example, when we're talking about climate mitigation, we tend to focus on what we should be doing here at home. And actually, I think taking a global view of this is really important. The atmosphere doesn't care whether 1 tonne of emissions is reduced in New Zealand or 1 tonne of emissions is reduced overseas. I don't say that because I'm buying into any kind of argument that what we do here doesn't matter. It absolutely does, for reasons I will come on to. But just to really note that if we don't approach climate in a global way, we are simply not setting ourselves up for thriving as we transition to a low emissions, climate resilient future. So what is the global context that we're talking about here? The starting point is, of course, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, I should say, and under that, the Paris Agreement. As many of you will know, the Paris Agreement is a multilateral treaty. It's been signed up to by about 195 countries, although probably soon to be one fewer countries signed up to the Paris Agreement. And the purpose of that agreement is to set out a global agreement on climate change. It contains a mixture of both hard obligations and soft commitments. And what I mean by that is that some of the things in the Paris Agreement are things that we must do. The main one, for the purposes of this session, is that we must communicate a nationally determined contribution that is essentially a pledge of how big of an emissions reduction we as a country and as a party to the Paris Agreement are going to try to achieve. It's not the same thing as a hard legal obligation to, in fact, achieve the nationally determined contribution, but we do have to communicate and we do have to make efforts towards achieving it. As you all probably know, the overarching objective of the Paris Agreement is to hold global warming to well below 2 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. There are also some aims relating to adaptation and mobilisation of climate finance, but I think for the purposes of today's session, the mitigation piece is the most pertinent. So that's the kind of broad multilateral agreement. And then when we look at then how that relates to trade, the first step is to say, how does it relate to what countries are doing domestically? So we've signed up to the Paris Agreement. We then have to work out how we're actually going to implement this thing at the domestic level within countries. And so all of the countries that are signed up are going through the same process of working out what architecture they have to have in place domestically to be able to achieve their climate commitments under the Paris Agreement. In New Zealand, we have the Climate Change Response Act that sets out our domestic emissions reduction targets and the framework by which we will set emissions reduction budgets and emissions reduction plans, etc. So that's the kind of very broad context. And then if we look more specifically about how that relates to trade, I think there are 3 main mechanisms here that are relevant. So the first is regulation in our trading markets. And what I mean by that is, as countries around the world are looking to how can we achieve our Paris Agreement targets, they're putting in place a whole suite of regulation. An example of this is that in Europe has put in place a carbon border adjustment mechanism to deal with what's known as emissions leakage. The idea behind emissions leakage is that, say, if you take a country like New Zealand, we have an emissions trading scheme that puts a price on emissions. If you're an emitter, you have to pay for each tonne of CO2 that you emit into the atmosphere. That makes the product that's produced in New Zealand, say it's aluminium, to take an example, potentially more expensive than a product that's sold in an overseas country produced in an overseas country that doesn't have an emissions trading scheme. And the idea is that a consumer might then take their purchase offshore. So the way we deal with that in New Zealand is we give out free units to that type of industry. The carbon border adjustment mechanism introduced by Europe is another way of doing this. It's basically saying, if you're going to export something into my country that's emissions intensive, we're going to tax you, so that it basically makes it more expensive to sell high emissions goods into Europe. So that's an example of an overseas jurisdiction regulating in a way that could potentially impact our trade. The second example is, second main area is stakeholder preferences. And so I think this is fairly obvious. This is about what our customers and investors care about. So New Zealand, as you know, we're an exporting, we export a lot of goods and services to overseas. And increasingly our customers and investors are demanding more in relation to sustainability. For example, if our customers are captured by overseas mandatory climate-related disclosures regimes, they're more likely to be asking their New Zealand suppliers to give them information about what they're doing on climate change. And a recent example of this is Nestle. So Nestle has set a net zero roadmap, and given Nestle makes chocolate, which relies on dairy, that flows through into what Nestle is asking of its suppliers here in New Zealand. So that's stakeholder preferences. And then the third, international trade agreements, and that's where the main focus of today's session will be. So the purpose of multilateral and bilateral free trade agreements is basically to set the rules for trade to improve market access and make it more efficient and profitable for the parties to engage in trade. FTAs are legally binding, and so they provide security and certainty for exporters. So the advantages here for New Zealand being party to these FTAs. And then when you look at the intersection with climate, trade agreements can be both an enabler and a detractor to climate action. So just to take a really simple example, if you sell a product, like say it's solar panels, or say it's more environmentally friendly aluminium than could be produced overseas, an FTA is really helpful in terms of enabling that product to get into an overseas market. On the other hand, there is some risk with FTAs that they might prioritise trade interests over climate action. And that has been mitigated to some extent over time, and Bjørn-Oliver will go to talk about this in a bit more detail through introducing trade and sustainability provisions into the FTAs themselves. But that is a potential downside of entering into a whole lot of free trade agreements. So I thought it might be helpful just to briefly touch on, to understand how these free trade agreements impact New Zealand and its exports and its international trading relationships. Where do our exports actually go to? So this is based on recent data. You'll see here our largest export market is China, followed by Australia, the USA, and then the EU as the fourth largest trading partner. That other category is obviously pretty big. The UK is part of that other category. It's quite a tiny amount that we actually export to the UK. And the reason I mentioned the EU and the UK in particular is because those are the free trade agreements that Bjørn-Oliver will go on to talk about. And then what exactly are our main exports, and how does that relate to climate change? So this is a little bit of a crude pie chart that I've created because I had to group some things together to make this work. But you'll see here there are plenty of areas where there are emissions packed into our main export areas. Areas like aluminium, dairy and meat, forestry, machinery, all of those types of industries have emissions associated. And the reason I highlight that is that obviously if we're exporting things with emissions, that means that there is risk associated with restrictions and free trade agreements, restrictions and regulation overseas, a higher risk of us being impacted by those things. Just before I hand over to Bjørn-Oliver, I thought it might be just a little bit helpful just to give a bit of a flavour for the direction of travel that's currently happening on international climate regulation. Because there has been a lot going on in the last few years. If we look at where we were 10 years ago to where we are now, climate regulation is very different from what it was. So broadly under Paris, a lot of countries have put in place now our framework legislation. We have framework legislation here in New Zealand. It's the Climate Change Response Act. The UK has a similar act. Australia now, as of 2022, also has a similar act. And those pieces of framework legislation basically set out targets and the high-level architecture around how you're going to meet your Paris Agreement commitments. And then other things that are happening on climate regulation, summarise them on this slide here. But we have climate-related disclosures and sustainability reporting. Some of you may have some direct experience of working with our mandatory climate reporting here in New Zealand. But this is an international trend that is continuing to develop at pace. Australia has just recently commenced its mandatory reporting, with reports starting to be produced from next year. Well, that comes into effect for 2025 onwards. And most of our markets that we export to now have some form of climate-related reporting or are planning some sort of climate-related reporting. And the implications of that are that some of our organisations might be directly captured by those overseas regimes, depending on the way that they operate. But probably more pertinently, many of our organisations will be customers or suppliers of those organisations they have to report, and that puts pressure on them to provide information overseas or to show that they're taking action on climate. Greenwashing regulation and taxonomies. This is a continually growing area. In New Zealand, we have general laws that say you can't mislead or deceive people in trade under the Fair Trading Act and under the FMCA. And similar regulation obviously exists in other countries, but we're also starting to see an uptick in specific regulation around greenwashing. Like the FCA has introduced an anti-greenwashing rule recently, so we're definitely seeing this as an increased area of focus. And again, this could have implications for our New Zealand businesses who are trading overseas. Emissions trading and voluntary carbon markets. So historically, emissions trading was really the main way that climate has been regulated internationally, particularly under the sort of Kyoto Protocol era. That's still a really, really important part of this and the primary part of climate regulation in a lot of jurisdictions. And basically the way that they work is they put a price on emissions. There are various different ways that they can operate. New Zealand has one, so does Europe, other emissions trading schemes in various places around the world. I've mentioned the voluntary carbon market there, but I won't go into it in detail because I think it's a bit too complex to get into in a 1 hour session. Then we have direct regulation. This is where countries just directly regulate emissions. We have that already. Ozone depleting substances. There is direct regulation in most countries of ozone depleting substances, equally GHG discharges in some situations, or fossil fuel bans, that type of thing. And then finally, taxes and levies, which I'll skip over in the interest of time because I've already talked about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So I'll now hand over to Bjørn-Oliver to talk a bit about the specific FTAs we've recently agreed. I think I have to stop my sharing. Hang on.
Here you go. Sorry, I hope you can see my slides now. Thanks, Jess, for the introduction, and thanks, Hannah, for kicking us off. Yeah, I'm Bjørn-Oliver. I work here at the Vic Law Faculty and am a board member of Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand. And what I'm trying to do now is I'll touch, I guess, quite a bit on topics where I brush over because we don't have that much time. I touch upon them so we can have a discussion later. So if you have any questions, write them down, put them in the Q&A. I won't be able to give you a detailed 20-minute introduction of all those topics, but I hope we can have a nice informed discussion afterwards. So what I'm covering as well is sort of taking a step back again, and Hannah mentioned that, well, trade is both good and bad, depending on your views, and there are some climate issues with trade and some climate issues that are being alleviated by trade. So the idea that trade brings us this clean technology, much cheaper, that has come true to some degree, but not at non-environmental costs on other areas. So we have to, when we talk about trade and climate change and trade and the environment, we always have to, of course, be aware of that. There is an environmental factor in free trade or in increased trade. And that is sort of what brought upon this increase in environmental provision. So trade law, WTO, GATT, and those rules, and then free trade agreements by themselves, they did not manage to contain those risks to the degree that was hoped. That's why we can see an increase in numbers of environmental provisions in those free trade agreements or preferential trade agreements, PTAs as well, which are not going full blow free trade, but are trade agreements between countries as well. So this data set is showing us a general trend. The next article takes a different data set, but the general trend again is fairly similar. And you can see there's a whole list of environmental norms that are quite popular in free trade agreements. So exceptions for the conservation of natural resources, that is the clear winner here. And then we will be mainly looking at provisions that look into implementation of other environmental agreements, because today's topic is mainly looking at pulling in the Paris Agreement into trade law and how that has been done. So again, just to give you the general background, the general gist that yes, trade and the environment has always been contentious, but with the introduction of those norms, the international community has tried to at least to improve the situation for the environment, and more often now as well for climate change in particular. And one of those examples is the trade agreement with the UK, which we recently signed, and that includes an article saying that parties affirm the commitment to implement the Paris Agreement and take actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's a fairly standard way of doing what I just mentioned, implementation of other environmental agreements. And again, this slide is just giving us numbers. It doesn't give us a test of how effective those provisions are, how well they have been implemented, what the actual effect of those are. But this is one of those examples where a modern trade agreement is taking the climate change agreement, Paris, seriously. It pulls it into, but it lacks enforcement or strong enforcement mechanisms in this particular case. There are other provisions which are relevant for climate. I just mentioned fossil fuel subsidy reform, trying to get both states to work together on those issues. So we broaden the traditional way of how we engage when it comes to trade. We broaden it, we pull in environmental issues that are linked to trade. And in doing so, the hope was that we strengthen international environmental law, climate change law as well. With those provisions where you don't really have strong enforcement mechanisms, the question is, well, do they really do that? But the new agreement between New Zealand and the European Union is supposed to be quite a step change in that regard. And over the next few minutes, I'll show you why I think that is the case. It's been coined the new gold standard in terms of climate and free trade. It did integrate like the whole package of trade and sustainable development, that is an EU approach pushing for more sustainability, environmentally focused provisions in its dealings with other countries promoting trade. Maybe here one word in terms of who is actually implementing those environmental standards into the free trade agreements, or who is pushing for them. There is a general trend that yes, it is more the developed countries, but the trend in South-South developing agreements is also increasing. So it's not only something where the rich countries that are already developed is now trying to impose on poorer countries, emerging markets. It is within the emerging markets increasing as well, and also developing countries trying to do more in terms of the trade and climate link as well, just as a side note here. So the EU has this push for introducing more trade and sustainable development elements in that trade agreements. As you can see, it has sort of general language and no backsliding when it comes to environmental protections that are in place. So making sure that the trade does not affect any of those that are in place. Again, talking about fossil fuel subsidies, but the biggie, of course, which I hope we'll have a good discussion on, is that Article 19.6 on trade and climate change. where in paragraph 2, it says that each party shall effectively implement the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement, including commitments with regard to national determined contributions, the NDCs Hannah was talking about already. And then a party's commitment to effectively implement the Paris Agreement includes the obligation to refrain from any action or omission that materially defeats the object and purpose of the Paris Agreement. And again, that basically just says, well, yes, you have to do your best to implement an environmental agreement. So without any additional elements, that would be basically the same what we've seen with the UK. You have to implement Paris. You do the best to do that. But what is new in this agreement is that the dispute settlement mechanisms, they specifically cover the trade and sustainability chapter. So the dispute settlement, I don't want to go into detail, but you start like always with consultations, you talk to each other. You can call upon a panel that looks into the issue, it files a report, you implement the report, and if you don't implement the report, or if one party thinks you don't comply with that, you may end up with mediation. So those steps are kicking in when you violate trade and sustainable development provisions under the New Zealand EU FTA. What is key, though, I think here is that in the provision in Article 27, it says that a party may also take such appropriate measures, and that links us to partnership agreement between the EU and New Zealand. Such appropriate measures which translate into in part or in full suspension, potentially, or termination, relating to this agreement in the event of an act or omission that materially defeats the object and purpose of the Paris Agreement. So if one of the parties being seen as doing that, materially defeating the object and purpose of the Paris Agreement, thinking about a Trump case, that would be definitely a violation where the other party could say, hey, okay, we pull the plug. So that is just a sign that the European Union has moved from what was traditionally seen as a cooperative, dialogue-based approach to their free trade agreements to one that is definitely more assertive. It's not comparable maybe to what the US and sometimes Canada does, like really sanctions, imposing strict sanctions regime automatically kicking in. Those kind of rules are not envisaged here, but it is definitely more assertive. And you can say to some degree it gives the Paris Agreement more teeth. So the Paris Agreement, we'll look into it very briefly in a second, is lacking strong enforcement mechanisms. So that's why climate change lawyers like myself got really excited about this conclusion of this article, saying, okay, here we have teeth that are outside of the climate regime, apply to the climate regime, which might help us implement the Paris Agreement more effectively, more quickly. Just very briefly, Paris is setting a limit. The aim of Paris is a warming limit of 2 degrees max, or working hard to stay below even 1.5 degrees. Most of you will have heard about that. And then when we talk about mitigation, we have a short-term target, peaking as soon as possible, then reducing with best available science rapidly, and then achieving net zero towards the end of this century. So that's the underlying goal of Paris. And how do we do this? We have NDCs, nationally determined contributions. So we have a global goal that is supposed to be achieved by nationally determined contributions. Flipping what we've done before on its head, like with Kyoto, we had targets per country negotiated internationally. Here it is up to the countries to set their own targets, but over time, those targets are supposed to become more strong, more strict, the rules around reporting, about how we calculate our emissions, about modeling, they become more strict, more in line with what everybody else is doing, what the IPCC is suggesting is sound science. So all of those rules, they at the beginning were rather, you can argue rather lax, but you can already see them tightening. And now with the global stocktake, you can see on the slide as well, things have really kicked into motion in terms of creating this accountability continuum. That is, we don't have one target, or not, the countries don't have one target they comply with and then it's all done. It is a bit more complicated, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if you have any questions. But we have mechanisms like the pledge and review, transparency framework, compliance. We have a compliance committee under Paris. And as I mentioned, the global stocktake, which told us you're not doing enough. The interesting part about the global stocktake is that it didn't say New Zealand isn't doing enough, which is also true. It said, well, the whole international community is not doing enough. But now it is up to the individual countries to say, okay, what do we take from that global stocktake for our own NDC? Because that is to be updated in February, by the 10th of February, the latest. We have to submit our second NDC. That has to be more ambitious than our previous one. So remember, the previous one was to lower the net greenhouse gas emissions by to 50% below gross 2005 levels. So that was our first NDC. Now we have to draft a second one. And that's where the trade agreements come in again, right? So we have agreed to a trade agreement that says you have to comply with Paris and with the NDCs. And part of that obligation is to ratchet up, to become more strict with our NDCs, to increase our ambition over time. And here you can see how all those elements are working together. So we do have the global stocktake, but we do have information sharing between the parties. So every 2 years, you have to submit a report on how you complied with your NDC, how you implemented it, whether you're on track, and if not, why you're not on track. And if you, for example, you use methodologies counting your emissions that are different to the standard, you have to also explain why you're doing this, because you may have an industry that is methane heavy, agriculture, like here in New Zealand, so you might choose different approaches, split gas approaches. So all of that can be taken into account when you draft your own NDC, but you have strict obligations of communicating that and making sure that you're trying your best to achieve or to contribute to achieving the temperature goal of Paris. Just very briefly, for the sake of time, there is another interesting development, I think, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, which is driven also by New Zealand. So you can see Costa Rica, Iceland, Switzerland, and us signed it. If there's anybody from MFAT on the call who would love to send me the text, you have my email. It's not available yet, of course, so it's still going through the legal testing, but they agreed on the text, the trade ministers, and it'll be very interesting to see how they fall into line, whether it is like a strict or more assertive way of including climate in the agreement, or whether it stays a dialogue based, what was the tradition also with the European Union. But the idea is to put climate change at the center of those trade agreements. It also is open to other countries, so they're trying to use it as a starting base to then invite other countries to join this agreement. And of course, for those countries, you can see that the numbers in terms of throughput is not huge, but still it is an interesting initiative, I think, to keep an eye out. And then I don't want to talk much about it because Hannah just mentioned it as well. It's not all FTAs, right? So there's a lot of trade obligations around which are outside of the FTAs, but they have can have quite an interesting implication for us here in New Zealand. Hannah mentioned the border adjustment mechanisms already, trying to prevent leakage. And then we have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive in the EU, which has now entered into force. And here the idea is to make sure that countries, first of all, know what's happening all along their supply chain. Not saying, well, we don't care. We just produce whatever it is in Switzerland that Nestle does. No, Nestle has to, if they implement it, has to also look into their supply chain across the globe. Where are human rights violations? Where are environmental issues, climate change issues? How can we help the supply chain to be more sustainable? So that's something to keep an eye on if, of course, a New Zealand company is part of that supply chain. They might be in compliance with New Zealand law, but the big company, the big multinational company might want the company to improve their performance because of that EU initiative. With that, I want to hand back to you, Hannah. So I hope there's a bit of food for thought and looking forward to our discussion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Bjørn-Oliver. I'm just going to try and get my slideshow back up. 2 seconds. Here we go. All right. So I thought it might be helpful, with all that context around these FTAs from Bjørn-Oliver, which is super helpful, just to talk a little bit about why New Zealand businesses should care if New Zealand were to breach a free trade agreement and have put their and/or fails to meet its NDC, as Bjørn-Oliver went through. The obligations under the NZEU FTA, which we'll talk mostly about because that's sort of the high watermark here, are around refraining from actions that materially defeat the objects and purpose of the Paris Agreement and around effectively implementing the Paris Agreement. And as Bjørn-Oliver mentioned, there are trade sanctions and some pretty kind of nuclear options available under the FTA. The question that comes up quite a bit, and you may have seen some discussion around this in the media, is would those trade sanctions ever be in fact exercised? And I think it's relatively well agreed that it's pretty unlikely that we would get to the stage that, for example, walking back a commitment under Paris would result in the EU terminating the FTA, for example. Because it's much more likely that there would be a sort of consultation period, an opportunity for rectification discussions between the parties before it gets to that point. But in theory, those options are there. And then the question is, well, if there was to be some sort of exercise of this kind of power, what would be the impact of that? If you think back to my earlier slide around exports, the EU is New Zealand's fourth largest trading partner. So there would be some direct impact, of course, if we lost market access rights that we have under the FTA to the EU. Having said that, the NZEU FTA was actually, there was quite a lot of discussion around the time that maybe our exporters didn't actually get that much out of it at the time. New Zealand doesn't have a lot of negotiating power sometimes in these FTA negotiations. So the impact directly for our exporters might not actually be that material of losing the benefits of the FTA, but that ignores the indirect impacts of this sort of thing, which are a little bit harder to quantify. But I think it's fair to say, well, my gut feel at least, is that it has the potential to be really damaging to New Zealand businesses if New Zealand is seen on the international stage to be in breach of a free trade agreement or to be materially rowing back on commitments it's made under the Paris Agreement. So that's the kind of waterfall, I guess, of potential impacts under the FTA. Bjørn-Oliver's obviously talked about the other types of provisions that are available in other FTAs. worth noting that it's not just this one in the NZEU one that says materially defeating the object and purpose of the Paris Agreement. Some of those talk about, not substantially weakening laws on environmental protection and climate change and things like that, which is another hook that could be deployed in these types of arguments around whether or not we're in breach of free trade agreements. Other potential impacts for New Zealand businesses, I think, really relate to our commercial and competitive advantage on the international stage. And if we're looking to be negotiating future FTAs, obviously it's more powerful if we've met our NDC, if we've upheld our obligations under previous free trade agreements as well. It looks good if we're shown to be complying with the spirit and intent of the Paris Agreement. I think that's a potentially significant impact, although it's a little bit hard to quantify. And I think it's worth looking at this in terms of both of the opportunity side and the risk side, right? So there's an opportunity to sell meeting our NDC or, complying with our obligations under free trade agreements to attract new customers and investment. We're seeing a little bit of that now in the sense that New Zealand, as a country that has mandatory climate-related disclosures, is at least, anecdotally at least, seen quite positively internationally. It shows that our companies here in New Zealand are doing the hard thinking about what their climate-related risks and opportunities are. So having that performance on climate is really helpful. When the Prime Minister takes trade delegations overseas, selling New Zealand Inc., that we're walking the walk on climate, and that supports our businesses to sell their products. And then the downside risk here, New Zealand's potentially seen as a less credible partner if we don't meet our NDC, if we're not playing the game on international relations. And then finally, and I think this is a really important point, if we don't meet our nationally determined contribution, that means there will be less mitigation globally than there would be if we did meet our nationally determined contribution. That's relevant for New Zealand businesses because what the mandatory climate-related disclosures regime has taught us is that virtually every business in New Zealand is impacted in some way by climate change. And if there is more climate impact, that's more climate risk for New Zealand businesses. I've written there, because that may seem a little bit remote, but I've written there every ton of CO2 reduced counts. It's a little bit of a trope that gets wheeled out in climate circles, but it's absolutely true. We're talking about marginal increments of global warming make a difference to extreme weather events and the impacts that has on people's businesses and lives. I just wanted to take a moment before we go to the questions, just to highlight this really good paper. If anyone's interested in issues around the nationally determined contribution and how we're going to meet it, Motu has just done a really wonderful paper on the question of how to meet the NDC through offshore mitigation. So our NDC will need to be met by both domestic action here in New Zealand and offshore mitigation, which basically means paying other countries to implement mitigation overseas, which has kind of reported in the media as being about writing a check to overseas countries. And this paper is really good at breaking down how we could do this in a way that would support our competitive advantage as a country rather than detract from it. And I just really liked this quote on the slide here that I think sums up some of the points that we've been talking about today. And in particular, delivering on the 2030 NDC through domestic action alone would be highly disruptive to the New Zealand economy. But failing to meet the NDC would shortchange the climate system and could raise significant risks for international relations and trade agreements. So that takes me to the end of the formal part of our presentation, but I see we've got lots of questions in the chat. I'll just stop sharing. Jess, do you want to marshal the questions?
Yes,
or
happy to do that. Yes, thank you everybody for your questions, and do keep them coming. I might start with one which has been asked, I think, by two people in separate ways, and it's about carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and in particular, whether or not we're likely to see further uptake of carbon border adjustment mechanisms both in New Zealand and globally. And then there's a second question as well, asking for comment on how the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism might impact New Zealand exports. And that question notes that Australia is also considering introducing this as well.
Yeah, so on this one, I'm happy to take this one first. So I think, yes, the answer is there are other countries considering a CBAM. The UK is introducing one. Australia is in the process of going through a carbon leakage review, which may result in a CBAM being introduced as well. As yet, no suggestion New Zealand will introduce a CBAM, but I think it's a conversation that's sort of actively on the table, perhaps for a future date. In terms of the impact on New Zealand exports, it's worth just thinking briefly about the sectors that the CBAMs apply to. It doesn't apply to dairy or to agriculture at all, I don't think, at the moment. What it does apply to is industries like cement, aluminium, those sorts of more industrial type areas. So we do export some of that stuff, but at the moment it's not a material amount that it's really causing problems for us as a country in terms of our exports. Bjørn-Oliver, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think you're right. The general trend is there. So more and more countries looking into it. I think in terms of what it covers, it's still worthwhile keeping an eye on where the discussion is going, because we know that methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So maybe one bloc will decide, well, we actually look into methane heavy products as well, which of course would include our dairy industry. That's one thing. And then the underlying issue again is like countries should do their own homework, right? We should do our homework. We should try and mitigate as much as we can here in-house, so we don't have to pay extra tax when we export. So that's one of the hopeful triggers of those CBAMs. But yeah, the general trend is there that more and more countries are looking into it.
Thank you both. The next question, again, I'm going to group a couple together, but there's a couple relating really to the question of enforcement, which you touched on earlier, Hannah. But the question is, will these FTAs actually be enforced, particularly when both parties to an FTA aren't necessarily on track to meet their NDC obligations or Paris Agreement obligations? And if I was to add a little flavour to this question as well, I think there's a question about what does effectively implement actually mean? How do we assess that? And I think really the question is, how much teeth do we think these FTAs are actually likely to have, and what would it take to be seen to breach them?
The $1 million question, Jeff. Yeah,
Who's
I mean,
going first? You go.
you go first, Bjørn-Oliver. I can crowd them behind you.
Great. Yeah, no, I think it's a good question, and I might have a slightly different view to Hannah on who's pushing for those implementation obligations or rights to push for them in the FTA, particularly with the EU in mind. So here we have the so-called gold standard because it actually is more assertive on paper. And Hannah said there are various reasons why the EU would probably not do it. But I think we have to, again, keep in mind that the EU, it's not a one homogeneous bloc, and they're all happy with that trade agreement. So there are some industries within the EU who did not want to sign that agreement. Farming, the agriculture industry was not very happy. So I can see a scenario where they are knocking on the door of the Commission saying, hey, what is our trade partner doing if we would fail to comply with Paris? And if that happens at a time in a country where there is an election, combined maybe with some European-wide elections, I can see this getting out of hand quite quickly, where the political, which we thought would never happen, creates momentum where they are pressed to do something. Will it be to kick us out of the FTA? I can't see that happening. But will it be that some of the tariffs are being reintroduced on some products? Why not? Just that it is in the treaty is a huge win, I think, for the climate, because it gives us another tool in the shade for making sure that Paris has more teeth. So that's just on the on that question about the implementation of those FTAs, of those provisions. Did you want to pick up on that, Hannah?
I don't really have much to add other than to say that the question of what effective implementation and materially defeating the Paris Agreement, I think, really remains to be seen. And there are a range of views around the place around what that requires the government to actually do to meet that. Certainly when the trade agreement with the EU was agreed, the government didn't think that they were agreeing to something that was materially different than what is already in the Paris Agreement. But that's all to be seen, I guess, at a future time. And I think there is a question as to whether a panel how the panel would actually go about assessing that as well, if you were going to go through the dispute settlement mechanism in the EU FTA.
Yeah, and just adding a comment here that we talk largely about due diligence obligations, right? So the procedural obligations, I'm sure we'll still comply with. Like, we keep submitting our NDCs, we keep communicating why we do certain things in a certain way. But the due diligence obligation of like being intact, doing our fair share, that is very tricky to establish. Putting a finger on, now you've crossed the line, to violating your obligation is super tricky. In particular, in an environment where basically all the other countries are also failing. So that's sort of the climate and activists' hope, is that we're all inactivists, we're all not doing enough, so no one will complain about us not doing enough. So that's the difficult part of making those obligations that are legally binding, making them really have the teeth we need to push for more climate action. But again, having it in an FTA, I think, is already very helpful.
Thank you. I think they were both really good answers to what I know was a tricky question. But I think the next question flows quite well from that, and it asks, do you think that the gold standard climate-related commitments in the NZ-EU FTA will be required or possible to replicate in other FTAs? E.g., in the context of New Zealand, might we see it in India FTA negotiations?
I don't actually have a clear read of this, I don't think, but I think I guess the first question is what FTAs are actually being negotiated, because we have a lot already in place already, but there will be some international ones being negotiated as well. I think so far in the EU is seeming to be a bit of a high watermark in this space, and now with political developments in the US and other places, that might suggest that we don't see a rapid, at least, rolling out of the same approach that's in the NZ-EU FTA. But I guess it's a wait and see. Bjørn-Oliver, I don't know whether you have any more specific insights on this point.
No, but just because another question asking about the FTA with the Gulf, and I don't have the text, so I only know what was shared online from the government. But if you read what they shared, it basically is what has happened before. So it recognizes the importance of addressing climate change, particularly under the UNFCCC Paris, recognizing the importance to cooperate on climate change issues. So it's all very soft touch. I don't think, and I didn't expect New Zealand to make climate a core issue of their FTA with the Gulf. But it all depends on the relationship. There's a reason why we managed to put climate more central with an agreement with Costa Rica, Iceland, and Switzerland. I don't see the same happening with India. So that's, it's just disparity in politics, power politics.
I think picking up on the politics point, there's a question here, which is something that the three of us were talking about before the webinar started, and that is not to remind everybody that Trump's been re-elected, but what do we think the implications of that are on this trend that we're seeing in terms of international trade and integration of climate? And the question that's been asked is, do you have any general thoughts on the future of trade and climate change post yesterday's US election? And I know you do.
Do you want to kick off, Bjørn-Oliver?
Sure, I can kick off. I think the US election, I mean, it will. And Bernard Hickey had a piece on that in his podcast this morning. So if you're interested, he has a focus on New Zealand economy, not only trade. The general idea that he will impose tariffs, flat tariffs across the board of between 10 and 20%, that will definitely slow trade. It will slow growth in some countries if he pulls that off. It seems like he has the power to do that at the moment. In terms of climate engagement, he might pull the US out of the Paris Agreement again. Is that bad? Yes. Is it terribly bad? I don't think so, because a lot of the things that Paris was set out to do, they have been set in motion. So it's very difficult for one country, even if it is the US, to torpedo that completely. But it'll definitely slow down our rapid response to climate change. So we will be slowed down by Trump. There's no talking around that problem. In terms of general link between climate and trade, and that picks up on a question from Catherine on investor-state dispute settlement and trade in general. It is still heavily economy trade based, what those rules allow in terms of protecting the environment and climate and human rights. So it's not the greening of international trade law is not really where it should be, definitely not. But that is where some of those agreements, including the New Zealand EU one, is giving an example that it can be done. And yes, at a small scale, definitely in terms of the use perspective, but still it is possible. And we will see some pick up on those ideas in other areas, in other regions as well. So I can see a slow improvement. One agreement doesn't change the whole system, but it is evidence that it can be done, and we'll see how the relationship between us and the EU will change how we see our climate change obligation, and hopefully it does put more pressure on the government, and that in turn then will help to green international trade in general. But yeah, Hannah, you have some views on the US election, I'm sure, as well.
Yeah, I think they largely echo yours. I think obviously it's not great, the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement for a second time. And I think what's a little bit even more worrying is that I think this Trump administration will be quite focused on trying to put in place as many measures as they can to future-proof their policies against a future swing back to the left. And that might mean trying to put in place some mechanism that makes it harder for the US to rejoin the Paris Agreement. I'm more worried about that than I actually am about the next 4 years, them being absent from the Paris Agreement. But like Bjørn-Oliver said, I have some reason for optimism, and that is really the positive tipping points piece of this. And if you think about climate as an economic issue, what is ultimately going to drive our transition to renewables is renewables being the most cost-effective and best way to make the climate transition work. And a lot of that investment is already there, including through the Inflation Reduction Act, which was put in place by the Biden administration, but more broadly across the world. The renewables transition is happening. So I have optimism about that. And the other thing I think, particularly in the US context, is that what we'll see is climate action, the sort of center point of it will shift from being the federal government to being at the state level. And so I'm expecting that we might see at COP next week a focus of the Biden approach being giving some reassurance to international markets that the states will continue to work on climate action regardless of what Trump is doing.
Yeah, thank you. I think those are all really, really great points. And we have reached time. That's an hour. But thank you both so much for your time. I think that was a really interesting discussion, delving into a topic that I think we often see in headlines and kind of scattered about in the climate conversation. But it's been fantastic to spend an hour really delving into what's happening in international trade and why it matters. So thank you both very much again. We'll endeavour to put the slides in this webinar up on our website. So if you want to review anything that we've said, feel free to take a look at that when we do so, and keep your eyes out for future webinars that we'll be holding. But thank you both very much again for your time. Hai kite.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.